how to create a study plan. Your timeline is going to be very different. Your approach to studying is going to be very different. But a lot of the principles that apply to planning for step 1 apply again for step 2. So I think I'll start by saying that when you will take your exam is going to be very different based on A, what your specialty is, B, what your medical school is, C, sort of what your plans are for, step 1 and step 2. I think the asterisks over all of this is that step 1 is going to be pass-fail in a year. I assume that most people, if they're joining this podcast, are planning to take step 2 within the next year, which means you've probably already taken step 1, so probably a moot point for most of you. I will say, I think increasingly programs are liking to see step 2 scores on the ERAS applications. Having said that, definitely check with all of the programs that you are sort of check with people in this year above you. If you're planning to apply to anesthesia, if you're planning to apply to radiology, if you're planning to apply to orthopedics, ask people who have done that, what is the general rule for step 2 exams? Do they like to see it before, or do they like to see it, or do they not care? And that will sort of inform whether you feel like you need to take it as soon as you finish 3rd year before you start to get into the sub-I world, or if you can wait a little bit and take it later in the process once you have more time. So that's the first thing. In general, most people have less time. I think that on average, my students probably spend between 3 to 4 weeks studying for 3 to 4 weeks of quote unquote dedicated time studying for step 2 on top of whatever they do throughout the year. So planning according to that is important, and figure out a time in your year based on the things that I already mentioned as to when that will be. Organizing yourself is extremely important. I think knowing your weaknesses and knowing your strengths is a big one. So as we mentioned, we talked already a little bit about this, internal medicine is going to be number 1. So really, if you can, try and really develop a robust understanding of IM throughout the year. But if you don't really know that that's going to be your focus, surgery should be next. Peds OB should be really pretty close together. So just understanding how much you need to do, and then organizing what you're going to use to study for those things. For peds, for example, a lot of my friends really liked the clip cases to study for the peds portion of their studying, even for step 2. Again, UWorld is over everything, but making sure you have a list of things that you want to get through, a list of resources you want to get through, which is different than when you were studying for step 1, right? When you were studying for step 1, most people will say, okay, I want to get through UWorld, I want to get through all of pathoma, I want to get through all of first aid. There are a couple of resources that cover everything. For these, not as much the case. There's going to be a little bit different for every single specialty that you're studying. And so it's going to be really important to stay organized and figure out what you're going to use throughout. And then just figuring out logistically how much time you need for each subject. So for example, if you're pretty weak in internal medicine, you may spend a full 2 out of your 4 weeks studying just IM topics. And that, I think, is very warranted if you feel like that's your weakest subject. If not, you may only spend 4 or 5 days doing IM topics and spending more time on surgery or pediatrics. So really knowing yourself and figuring out how much time you need to do everything. And then, of course, all of this with a grain of salt, knowing that sometimes you realize you know more than you thought you did, or you know less than you thought you did. So adjusting, being adaptive, and understanding that it's sort of a work in progress and the plan will change every day. But just making sure you have a plan when you start, so you don't get to week 4 and realize, oh, I never even touched any of obstetrics before you take the exam. So very, very important to try and be organized throughout all of this.
Yeah. That was great, Sana. The other thing too, I think you got really well too, is being adaptable, being flexible. You want to have a plan in place, but knowing that things could change. And also, I found it really important to sort of underestimate, am I saying that right? Underestimate the time that I would have. You are going to have, especially if you're taking this, if you're busy traveling for interviews, or if you're taking this during a clerkship, or you may be forced to take this during a clerkship that's a little more time intensive, you're going to be really tired some days, not every day, but some days you're going to be unexpectedly tired, or you're going to be unexpectedly late coming back. And it is okay to have days where you just say, listen, I just need to like read a novel and go to bed, or I need to watch something on
Absolutely.
Netflix and go to bed. And I think if you can, in your schedule, if it's at all possible, have a day perhaps where you just have, this is a catch up day or a rest day. And it can be, you can move it around as you need, but to build a couple of those into your schedule, knowing that they're just going to be some days, especially if you're on a surgery. I mean, you may get home at 9 p.m. and the last thing you want or even should do if you have to get up at 4 is study. And that's just going to happen every so often. Hopefully it's not every day, but just having enough of those little pick me up days, where you can kind of take a breath or catch up on material or just catch up on your mental health and your sleep, I think is really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this kind of gets to that idea too, right? That this slide is really about what is ideal versus what is reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everyone who's in medicine starts with, has wonderful intentions, is a really hard worker. And ideally, you're motivated and have enough time, most importantly, to incorporate all the resources that we've mentioned. And you're able to fully use all the important chapters and sections and review every single thing multiple times and really hone in on your weaknesses. And sometimes reality kicks in and it's going to be a little bit different than what you thought or hoped it might look like. So some of the modifications that my students often have to make in these situations is, picking specific topics for specific resources. So what I mean by that is, if you are the type of person who knows you like Sketchy, for example, but can't get through all of Sketchy Path, or maybe you didn't even look at that, but you think it would be useful, but it's just too much time to try to start using that resource. Instead, say, listen, for micro, I'm going to do UWorld micro and Sketchy micro. And that's going to be, those are going to be the only two resources that I use. I'm not even going to bother looking at my first aid for step 2 CK chapter on microbiome. Or if I do, I'm going to skim it quickly and really use it to make sure there's no big gaps in my knowledge. So I'm picking a specific topic for that specific, specific resource for that specific topic. Whereas maybe online med ed, maybe you really liked their neuro section and you feel like there isn't really a great other resources for neurologic issues, and you want to use online med ed just for neuro to supplement your UWorld questions on neuro. And that's kind of a nice way, especially if you're the type of person who feels kind of some FOMO about, different resources and not using them all. That can be a nice way to incorporate different resources in a way that's still manageable. The key, as you've probably already experienced in medicine, is not to get overwhelmed by the number of resources. And I don't know about you, Sana, but we have to take like board exams for anesthesia, and I still fall into this trap of there's so many resources. There's a new one every year. One resident says they love the resource. You have to do this resource. And in reality, I run out of time and end up using kind of the two tried and true resources that everyone's been using for, decades. And it's good to find this out early, I think, and just focus on quality, not quantity. Those really key resources.
Yeah, could not agree more. I think really knowing yourself, figuring out what works for you, those are, I think everyone probably is getting that those are our sort of recurring themes for the night, is really figuring out what makes sense for you and how to best use the resources that are geared towards your type of learning. And so what we have here is sort of a sample timeline that we would suggest for maybe a student who was studying for step 2 who had a little bit more time, say 6 weeks. And so what we do at Med School Tutors is we sort of create these timelines for our students so that they have an idea and a schedule when they're planning to embark on their studying process. And so oftentimes, like I said, you'll have somewhere around, probably in all of this ends up being maybe 4-ish weeks of medicine. And then you end up spending a day every week doing a practice exam, sort of testing your knowledge, seeing where your deficits are, and also seeing how you're doing, tracking your progress along the way. All of this to say you're still building a UWorld throughout the day. And then if you look at the bottom half of the image where we have here, you can see that not only is this just Monday is cardiology, you sort of break it down a little bit further. I want you to read IM Essentials from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. And then you're going to do another hour of online med-ed videos, and then you're going to do 2 blocks of UWorld, and really being granular about the details that you put into your day, because just saying, I'm going to study cards today is really a very difficult thing to do. And very few people, I think, are able to sort of be productive with that and be really efficient and useful with their time. And so just being very, very granular about it, I think can be important. So that's where all of those pieces we were talking about before in terms of the schedule, knowing what resources you're going to use, knowing which ones are best for which, knowing how much time you need to spend on cardiology, how much time you need to spend on surgery. That's how all of this sort of comes together in making this timeline. And I think that this is really, really important for anyone who is embarking on the beginning of their studying process. Oops, skipped ahead a little.
That's perfect. I think that's a great study schedule. And I think it's really important to be as specific as you can in terms of your daily goals and your weekly goals. And as you're creating the schedule, it's really important as kind of a final reality check to do the math and really ask yourself, is this feasible? Everyone has these ideal goals that they would like to, accomplish, and all of these resources they would like to get to in a limited amount of time. But you need to be honest with yourself. So be honest with yourself now so that you can set realistic goals that you can meet, and you can be really effective and efficient in achieving those goals. So make sure to ask yourself these questions. Have you overestimated your capacity to study? Have you thought about whether you really have it in you to, be doing, 5 hours of studying on top of your surgery clerkship? Is that really reasonable or safe, to be doing that? Have you built in flexibility? As I mentioned, maybe you're the type of person who needs one of those kind of flex days where you can sort of move it around as you want in your schedule, but have, if your clerkship runs over and you get sick and you just can't study that day, to have room in your schedule for that. Are you going to burn yourself out? All the more important, I think everyone's incredibly stressed during this time, with the pandemic, and thinking, is this going to sort of push me over the edge, this schedule that I'm setting myself out on? Obviously, you want to challenge yourself. And I think all of you know that you are capable of incredible things and incredible feats of studying and preparation. So it's important to believe in yourself and know that you can really rise to this occasion. But at the same time, you're human and you need to look out for yourself. So make sure that you ask yourself this question: are you going to burn yourself out? And related to that, are you really going to be doing quality studying? So sure, maybe you'll be sitting in front of the computer for 5 hours, but you'll be half asleep because you haven't been trying to get 4 hours of sleep, while you're on your clerkship. Is this really quality studying? So these are kind of 4 questions that we recommend asking yourself as you're preparing the schedule. And as you go about the schedule, every day, kind of ask yourself, is this reasonable? Is this flexible? And is this really the best quality studying I can do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is exactly right. It's just sort of, again, going back to that theme of what we were talking about before, is just staying adaptable and staying honest with yourself. Just making sure you're checking in with yourself and seeing how your progress is going, and what you need to change and what you need to do to make yourself be the most productive that you can. Just be honest with yourself in regards to what works and what doesn't work. And sort of along the realm of being honest with yourself, one thing that we really highly recommend is continuing to track your progress throughout the entire study period. And one question we get all the time is, what self-assessments should I be taking? How many should I be doing? How often should I be doing them? And of course, as anyone could guess, our answer is it depends. So depending if you have 2 weeks to study versus if you have 6 weeks to study, my answer is going to be very different. If you have 2 weeks to study for this exam, I would say 1, maybe 2 practice tests, because you're going to need to spend the majority of your time focusing on content, focusing on driving home the majority of that material so you are sure that you know it. Taking a practice test takes an entire day out of the equation. It will take you 4 hours to do the test. It's exhausting. You're going to be super tired. And then on top of that, you have to go back and review all of the blocks. So it is a whole day affair. And so if you only have 2 weeks to study, that takes 1 out of 14 days out of the equation. If you have 6 weeks, as in that practice schedule that we created, I think it would be reasonable to consider doing maybe 1 a week, maybe less frequently than that, depending on how your studying is going, but really to calibrate based on how much time you have and on how you're doing. I think another thing I really want to emphasize about practice tests is, yes, you should use them to get a sense of where you are and get a sense of, you know, what you could or may expect on the exam as far as the score, but also really, really spend time going through the cases and seeing, am I as strong in cardiology? Am I as strong in surgery? The best thing about these tests is that they can show you where your deficiencies are. And so that is, I think, a really important thing that a lot of students, including myself when I was studying for it, but a lot of my medical students struggle with, is just saying like, oh, well, I really want this score and I'm not there yet. And I'm like, yes, but we can also look at this and say, okay, what part of this am I not as strong in and how do I get better? And so there are a number of them, as we mentioned, the NBME practice exams for the shelf, the NBME practice exams for step 2, and the UWorld exams for step 2. So the shelf exams I generally advise my students to be taking throughout the year as they are taking their individual shelf exams. These ones I typically, unless you haven't taken any of them before, I would say they aren't as useful during the actual step 2 study period, the dedicated period per se. The UWorld exams, very, very useful, and the NBMEs are great as well. If you only have time for 1 or 2, I typically tend to push my students towards the UWorld exams, but the NBME exams are also excellent. So really can't go wrong. And again, I would say probably take 1 when you start out, and then based on how often you're taking them again, I would take another one maybe a week out from your exam. Any additional thoughts on that, Taylor? That's typically what I advise my students, but what have you said to yours?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think the UWorld self-assessments are certainly the best, mostly because they're another set of UWorld questions written by the same people. And if you think about it, these are written by people who have already compiled this UWorld question bank, which is quite difficult. So this is sort of the next level of questions that they could come up with based on questions they had, gaps that they were trying to fill in terms of their question bank. So these are very hard questions often. I try to tell my students not to get discouraged about the UWorld self-assessments, but they're fantastic in that they're challenging. They kind of help you practice staying calm when you maybe don't know every aspect of the question. And the explanations are really where the money is. You don't get that level of detailed description with the NBMEs. When I was taking them, I was lucky if I got the right answers for the shelf exams. I think eventually we even provided the correct answers, but you certainly didn't get an explanation. So the UWorld really is valuable. I think that's great to focus on those as your self-assessments if you're strapped for time. Yeah,
definitely.
And this slide is really about, how do you adapt? How do you reassess in real time? Because as we mentioned, this is a flexible schedule. As much as you want to stick to it as much as possible, things change, and you do really want to be agile. And like Sana was saying, if you notice a deficiency in cardiology, for example, don't just ignore that. Really say, you got this information for a reason, and it was to be able to really address this problem that you have and really make it one of your strongest points when you take the exam. There's no reason to think you can't do that. So really make sure some people do this actually at the end of every day. Sometimes I encourage students at the end of the day, just take a couple minutes to think what worked well today, what can I do a little bit differently tomorrow, whether that's what do I start with in the morning? What time should I get up in the morning? Little things like that. And then kind of having a weekly sit down that's maybe 10 to 15 minutes and really ask yourself, what worked well this week? What do I need to change in terms of next week's schedule? And please don't feel like a calendar needs to be static. That doesn't necessarily mean you're doing everything correctly if you're just sticking to the plan, because things change, you get more information. You should adapt as you find out that you're weak in a certain area, or you're really strong on psychiatry. Maybe you don't need to spend 2 days reviewing it, for example. Make sure to adapt to your changing circumstances and needs. And don't spend, I think it's hard when you're a perfectionist perhaps, and we're used to really trying to understand every detail of everything. Don't spend too much time on one particular subject. That's not to say that you shouldn't embrace your weaknesses and really trying to hone in on those, but at the same time, you don't want to do that at the cost of all the other information that's going to be on the exam. So this is a hard balance to strike. You won't necessarily get it correct the first time. So that's why reassessment and adaptation is really important. You really do, unfortunately, need the breadth as well as the depth.
Definitely something that is very easy to not do, because it's very easy for us to focus on the things that we know we're good at, but really challenging yourself and pushing yourself to focus on the things that are more challenging for you.